James, there's a word that comes to my mind when looking at the Third Ypres campaign. And tell me if you agree with this word, okay?
Okay.
The word is slog.
Yeah, that sounds really good. I was thinking futility, but that's probably even better.
Oh, yeah. I mean, and I even looked up slog in the dictionary. There's different definitions, but it's a drudging act that seems to accomplish nothing. And this is it. There's mud. Everything is sinking in mud. And I'm not talking after a rain in your backyard when you get a little bit of mud on your shoes. I mean, you walk in and it's almost like quicksand, mud to your waist. Everything is sinking in several feet of mud. Tanks are stuck. Cars are stuck. Artillery pieces. Horses are stuck. But it's not just mud. It's not just the inconvenience. It's being stuck with shells exploding everywhere, nature being obliterated. And if you've ever seen images of World War I where there's high contrast black and white pictures where it looks like this hellscape, it's mostly mud, it's mist, maybe there's a shattered tree with most of its limbs blown off and soldiers trying to walk through with pockmarked holes and mist rising from the plains. That's in the Third Ypres campaign. And there's cases where men are drowning in the mud. I read one account where a digger fell off of duck boards in the dark and he sank up to his neck. And his mates are trying to get him out with a chain of rifles, but he's drowning and he's begging to be shot. And just one other thing before we get started, there's a quote by Private R.A. Colwell, who wrote this regarding the campaign. There was not a sign of life of any sort. Not a tree, save for a few dead stumps, which looked strange in the moonlight. Not a bird, not even a rat or a blade of grass. Nature was as dead as those Canadians whose bodies remained where they had fallen the previous autumn. Death was written large everywhere. So in the previous episode, we ended with the revolutions in Russia, and we went through 1917, and we're going to go back to the beginning of 1917, where Germany is resuming the practice of unrestricted submarine warfare. They're sinking merchant ships in international waters, and many worried that if the British Army couldn't capture bases on the Belgian coast, then the British Army might run out of supplies due to a lack of shipping. And French soldiers are becoming wary too, and some are beginning to mutiny. So the British Army thinks that they have to have an offense of their own. So those are some of the things going on. But what else should we keep in mind before we dig into this battle, James?
All right, well, we can't forget the major battles of 1916 we talked about, especially Verdun, which was kind of in the southern part of the line in the Western Front, and then the Somme, which was further to the north. Those had been just obviously massive battles, each with about roughly, depending on where you read, about 1 million casualties each. So about something around 2 million men had either been killed, wounded, captured, or just disappeared. Both sides were bleeding. Both sides were hurting, but it's a war, right? You have to do something. You can't just sit there. And as you mentioned, there's starting to be rumblings in the lines. So when you're a football coach and your team, it's at the half and your team is losing badly, what do you often do? You replace the quarterback. So let's try a different quarterback. So the French government finally, after 2.5 years or so, they replaced the beloved Joseph Joffre with Papa Joffre with Robert Nivelle as the chief of staff. So they're going to hand the ball, so to speak, to Nivelle and see if he can move the team down the field. On the German side, the new overall commander of the army was Paul von Hindenburg, but as we've already discussed multiple times, Hindenburg was really more of a figurehead, more of a presence, the face. He was kind of like, we mentioned this before, he was like the Great Oz up on the screen saying, pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. The man behind the curtain was Erich Ludendorff. Ludendorff was really calling the shots. He was running things for Hindenburg. They made a great team. Hindenburg was the face of the organization. Ludendorff moved the X's and O's, so to speak. But they are now in charge of the German army, not just in the east, but in command of the entire German army. And they are going to make some changes. They already have made changes on the Western Front. They'll continue to do that. In fact, speaking of the change, in January 1917, the German army withdrew to a new defensive position called the Hindenburg Line. It was a vast system of defenses with deep trenches, concrete bunkers, defense towers, and many other strong defensive features. And as they withdrew, they laid waste to the countryside, and they deported many French and Belgian men to Germany as slave laborers. In fact, they blew up their own former trenches. A couple books I was reading talked about how one day the British woke up to see the Germans shelling, and they thought, oh, here we go again. We're about to get shelled. Here comes another artillery attack. But they were attacking their own position. They were attacking their former trench line so that the British and French could not get control of them. So radicals, this idea that you had under the previous commander, von Falkenhayn believed that you never give up an inch of territory. Ludendorff did not subscribe to that philosophy. He said, if we have to, we'll give up. We'll move back to a more defensible position, a tighter line, which isn't so long and so wavy. And I started to say wiggly. That's not a very professional military term, but you can hold it with fewer guys. So it's a really good strategic retreat. In February of 1917, the British and French forces made minor gains against the Germans, but they began to launch a major attack on April 4th. On April 4th, the British began barraging Arras in preparation for a planned attack on that area. 5 days later, they launched an attack that began the Battle of Arras. A Canadian force captured Vimy Ridge. The Canadians were super kick-butt soldiers, and they did a great job of capturing this ridge. Then on the French side, the new French Chief of Staff, Robert Nivelle, ordered a French attack on April 16th, beginning what is usually called the Second Battle of the Aisne, or the Nivelle Offensive. The French used tanks in this battle for the first time, but the tanks were ineffective, as they usually are the first time they're used. And this attack turned into a disaster. The French were turned back, and they took 96,000 casualties. Nivelle had said, I will achieve a breakthrough in 48 hours. So they gave him another day, but it just didn't work. The attack was called off on the 20th. The morale of the French soldiers decreased. The offensive lasted until late May. There were minor attacks, but it was an unmitigated disaster for the French army. And Nivelle is going to get sacked. On the 23rd, the British attacked in the Battle of the Scarpe without success. Over the next few days, both British and French forces continued to attack the German lines with little success. So constant fighting going on, but very little ground is being gained. That seems to be a common theme in World War I, doesn't it, Scott? Especially on the Western Front. Little ground is gained. Then, on April 28th, the French Minister of War makes a momentous decision. He fired Nivelle and replaced him with Henri-Philippe Pétain as Chief of Staff. Nivelle, by the way, was asked to resign. He refused, but he was fired anyway. He was a very proud man. Pétain is going to make some major changes. In April and May, small numbers of French units mutinied. They said, we're not going to do any more attacks. We'll stay in the trenches. We're not going to desert. We're not going home. But we're just not going to launch any of these foolish suicidal attacks. And Pétain made some changes. On April, let me talk a little bit more about the mutiny. Some authors say it's more like a strike, like the army going on strike. They agreed.
Right, there's just not a term for that, for striking in the military. So, yeah, we have to say mutiny.
Yeah, mutiny is the closest thing. They agreed to man the trenches, but they refused to attack. Many mutineers were arrested and some were executed. But for the most part, Pétain tried to, instead of cracking down and just executing all the mutineers, you'd lose half your army. He promised to improve conditions for soldiers. He got better food, better supplies, and he promised to not send them into any more pointless offensive, and the soldiers appreciated that. On May 4th and 5th, British and French forces made gains, but British casualties were up to 4,000 per day, and that was the highest daily rate throughout the war, even higher than the Somme. So just not a lot of success. This attack is not off to a good start. And we haven't even gotten to the key battle yet. This is just a prelude. So what do you think about those mutinies, Scott, and Pétain and all that? What are your thoughts on all that we've discussed so far?
Well, this is in the early 20th century, and I don't think it's going to go very well for them. Let's just see what happens to them, but I'm not optimistic for their chances.
Right. All right. So in the spring of 1917, General Douglas Haig, or Marshal Haig, commander of the 1st British Army. Actually, I'm sorry, he's not the head honcho yet. I'm jumping the gun here. He's still the commander of the 1st British Army. He hasn't taken over for Sir John French. He began planning an offensive centered around Ypres. Top naval commanders supported this idea because they believed Ypres was the one place where their naval guns could support the infantry. The Navy wanted to do an amphibious assault. That would have been interesting, wouldn't it? They even constructed floating docks off the coast of Flanders. Haig hoped to combine an amphibious assault with a land assault, hitting the Germans from 2 directions, but the amphibious assault could not occur until a breakthrough on land did. You didn't want to just drop a bunch of guys on the coast and leave them high and dry. They had to link up with the forces coming from the west on the land. And by the way, I misspoke. Haig is actually the overall commander at this point of the British Expeditionary Force. I'm sorry, it's been a couple weeks since we've talked about the Western Front. I've been studying the East. I've been studying the Middle Eastern situation lately. So, Haig is the overall commander of the British armies. Anyway, Haig hoped to combine an amphibious assault with a land assault, hitting the Germans from 2 directions, but the amphibious assault could not occur until a breakthrough on land did. Haig decided the amphibious assault would get the go-ahead when the British took the town of Roulet, which is 10 miles inside the German lines. And the weather would be key. Flanders is flat with a high water table, and Haig's staff read weather reports going back 80 years and concluded that, quote, in Flanders, the weather broke early each August with the regularity of the Indian monsoon. So Haig was determined to get started before August. He wanted to get the attack off before it would just turn into a deluge.
Yeah, and one thing I'm wondering reading that, so the planned amphibious assault, correct me if I'm wrong, James, I'm not aware of any large-scale amphibious assault in the First World War. Am I missing something?
No, there is not one.
Okay.
Well, we just gave away this. Spoiler alert, people. It's not going to happen.
Well, I was saying that because I thought it'd be interesting. I mean, we don't have a kind of a proto D-Day type of situation. We don't have paratroopers. There's no 101st Airborne Division.
Right.
So just kind of like the evolution of warfare, there are different possibilities happening. So this is why they have to link up. But I wanted to mention some of the things you were talking about where when they were looking at weather reports and that they saw that it broke in August. This is also an area that's susceptible to reverting to swamp because it was swampland. Ypres area was reclaimed marshland. If the drainage system were to be destroyed by prolonged bombardment, and no way something like that would happen in World War I, just a giant artillery barrage, right? So then that's going to happen too. So it's not just getting there before the season changes, but moving fast enough before enough destruction happens that the infrastructure is destroyed and it becomes this horrible scape where having speed to be able to move infantry and tanks and other things rapidly is almost impossible. So just another thing there.
Yeah. All right. So Haig was hoping to take one salient to use as a forward staging point. Remember, a salient is a big bulge in the line, so to speak. And another interesting factor at play here is that the British had been digging tunnels since 1915. They recruited a bunch of people into the army that had been miners. So they're digging these tunnels and hoping to blow up a lot of explosives under the German lines. They finished 19 of these tunnels under the German lines and packed them with explosives. So we'll see a little bit later how that works out.
Oh, yeah. Well, yeah, let's keep going with the Battle of Messines. Is that correct?
Messines, yeah.
Messines, yeah. Okay. We're not Francophiles here, people. We're doing our best.
We're doing our best, yeah. Let me tell you, Scott, it's going to be a blast.
Boom.
All right, thank you. So the British, led by General Herbert Plumer, began with a week-long artillery barrage, the heaviest in history to that point, heavier than at the Somme, Verdun. They just keep pouring on more and more artillery as the war progresses. He had one gun for every 7 meters of front, which is amazing. That's about 7 meters. What's that about? 20 22, 23 feet. So
they're literally leaving no stone unturned.
Yeah, lots and lots of firepower coming at the Germans. What could go wrong?
Nothing.
On June 17th, all of the mines in the underground tunnels were detonated. The blast was so powerful that it was felt as far away as London. One soldier later wrote this, quote, "The whole earth seemed to rock and sway, several of the men and myself being thrown down violently. It seemed to be several minutes before the earth stood still again. Flames rose to a great height. Silhouetted against the earth, I saw huge blocks of earth that seemed to be as big as houses falling back to the ground. It was awful, a sort of inferno." End of quote. And I do not remember where I got that from. I did not write it down, so I apologize. But I want to mention here regarding these mines and these explosives being set off. There's a great movie about this called Beneath Hill 60. It's an Australian film, and it talks about how dangerous it was for these soldiers to be digging down way under the earth and, going under German lines, and the Germans were digging counter tunnels, and both sides were listening to each other. They had listening devices stuck up against the walls of the tunnel, and then there was the problem of water, because we talked about how high the water table is, and they had to work really hard to keep water out of the tunnels and keep the explosives dry and all that. It's a fascinating movie, so I strongly recommend that. And as I've said before, Scott and I will put together a list of books, documentaries, and films that we recommend on this. But it's a good movie because it takes you down underground, and you feel like you're down in the tunnels with the men and dealing with the stresses they had to deal with.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors.
Hello, this is Dr. Doug Grotheis, host of Truth Tribe, where we seek the truth through reason and evidence about what matters most. And we are not tribal, since truth is for everyone. Please join me at the Truth Tribe as I discuss the reasons for Christian faith, the Christian worldview, and moral issues such as abortion and gender ideology. To listen now, go to lifeaudio.com or search Truth Tribe on your favorite podcast app.
Once in a generation, a podcast comes along with the power and eloquence to inspire us all.
This show will entertain you while you wait for that one. Join two best friends, author and former history teacher John Driver and comedian Johnny W. for hilarious and authentic conversations about life, history, culture, faith, and everything in between.
You can listen to Talk About That wherever you find your podcasts or at lifeaudio.com.
Are you concerned about tensions in the Middle East? Do you wonder where we're currently at in the biblical timeline? Are we really in the last days? Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Carl Muller with the Inside the Epicenter podcast. Every week, my co-host, best-selling author Joel Rosenberg and I answer those questions and more. You'll hear inside knowledge of our meetings with leaders at the highest levels of government in the U.S., Israel, and the Middle East, equipping you to filter the news with biblically sound insights. Find Inside the Epicenter on your favorite podcast app or go to joshuafund.com to listen and subscribe.
So when these explosives were set off, about 10,000 German soldiers were immediately killed. 10,000 just gone. 7,000 were taken prisoner and thousands of others were stunned. So you would think the Germans would be able to just march in and take over, right? They did take possession of a group of craters over 6 feet deep, but the British only penetrated a mile or so into German territory. Some scholars believe that here the British missed an opportunity to push further.
Right. You think they would have been able to do better, and maybe they were misjudging things, because with the Battle of Messines that we're talking about here, it did give them confidence. They could have done more with it, but in World War I terms, I mean, just being able to push this far, a mile, really is something there. But it alters their judgment and gives them too much confidence for efforts that follow. Later on, when Haig is talking with his army commanders on what they should do with the oncoming offenses, one commander suggested they go all out, and Haig agreed, counting on an early breakthrough. And he's even talking to his army commanders about the opportunity for a massive cavalry strike, which I haven't really seen anything like that before. But we're going to see if something like that is going to happen. So What are they doing to prepare for the Third Ypres?
All right, so the British are hoping to follow up this semi-success, if you will, with a major breakthrough. And this is going to be, it's near the town of Ypres, where we already had 2 battles, and this will be the third. So the British continue preparations for the planned amphibious assault, but the Germans, using observation balloons, were aware of what the British were doing. And they decided they're not just going to sit there and let them do it. They're going to steal a march, so to speak, on them. On July 10th, the Germans launched Operation Beach Party. They passed out drinks. They had a...
Yeah, Frankie and Annette were there.
That's right. The Beach Boys were invited. No, not that kind of beach party. This is not going to be a party you want to be at. They drove the British back westward away from their planned landing site. So much for the amphibious assault. In this attack, the Germans used Blue Cross gas, which was designed to irritate enemy soldiers so much that they would tear off their gas masks. And then soon afterwards, they began using mustard gas. So just really, really devious on the part of the Germans, and really kind of cruel. You know, they get irritated. They just want to scratch, and then they tear off their mask, and then they get hit with mustard gas, which would kill you pretty soon. In late July, the British began an artillery barrage, set the date for a ground assault on July 31st. The German position to be attacked was Passchendaele, which is another village. It was on high ground, and there was no cover because all vegetation had been destroyed. The drainage system was destroyed too, so any rain would turn the ground into muck. But of course, it's not going to rain, right?
No, of course not. There's no historical data.
Not until August.
We're good.
Germans had only quote unquote only 1,500 heavy guns to 2,300 for the British, but their defenses were extremely strong. The Germans had become masters at defense at this point. John Keegan writes this: the completed Flanders position was actually 9 layers deep. In front, a line of listening posts in shell holes, covering 3 lines of breastworks or trenches in which the defending division's frontline battalions sheltered. Next, a battle zone consisting of machine gun posts supported by a line of pillboxes. Finally, in the rearward battle zone, the counterattack units of the division sheltered in concrete bunkers interspersed between the positions of the supporting artillery batteries. You have to wonder if the British really fully grasped how strong the German defensive system was. And if so, maybe they wouldn't have just said, oh, let's just hit it head on. I don't know. It's just a thought. But on July 26th, the British sent 700 planes into the air. They quickly gained air superiority.
Much easier than World War II, that's for sure. Basically, if you put planes up and the other one doesn't have any set up.
Right.
But here, we're putting all the pieces on the table, and the British are still expecting a fast breakthrough. For an early breakthrough, which is what Haig is counting on, the vital importance was surprise. But he's choosing to attack in the bare Flanders plain, and everything that he's doing can be seen by the eyes of the German observers, to say nothing about planes. And their bombarding gave them further warning. So there's going to be no element of surprise going on here, that's for sure.
All right, so the battle begins at 3:50 a.m. On July 31st, the Allies began a creeping barrage. And remember, that's, for our listeners, that is a situation where they fire shells and the infantry follows pretty closely behind them. The infantry wants to be close enough so that when the artillery barrage is let up, then all of a sudden, poof, there they are. They're right there up on the Germans, on the defenses, but they don't want to be too close, obviously, because they don't want to get blown up by their own shells. The British fired 4.25 million shells. That's just boggles the mind. They keep increasing the number of shells they fire. They're trying to set the Guinness Book of World Records number of shells fired and break their own record with every battle. The infantrymen then went over top, jumped into no man's land, headed across no man's land across a 25-kilometer front. There were 500,000 men attacking along with 136 tanks. And the attackers initially made good progress. How many times have we seen that, Scott? I mean,
here we go. Yeah.
It's like you could almost use the same template for almost every battle on the Western Front. big artillery barrage, go over the top, make good progress at the beginning, and then not so much.
Something happens.
Something happens. What's the
something?
What's the something? Yeah, the only thing that's
earthquake. Earthquake. Got to mix it up a little bit.
I think an army of like 10,000 orcs in Uruk-hai appeared. No, just kidding. Wrong movie. The German front lines had largely been destroyed by the artillery, and then here's the something. It is, drum roll please, rain. The heaviest rain in 30 years.
July 31st, gentlemen, one day early.
Yeah, wait a minute. You said August. What is this? Before long, the tanks became bogged down. The attackers were slowed by the mud. German counterattacks soon halted the Allied advance. By late afternoon, the battle halted. It was renewed the next day, and the British made a little more progress, but after that, the rain prevented any more operations. They just had to give it. You just can't. You can't defy Mother Nature sometimes. British casualties were 31,000 from July 31st to August 3rd. That's 4 days, 31,000. And you got a quote, Scott?
Yeah, you can just feel the anger, disappointment with the British because they're finally making progress. They planned everything. They did everything right. But then nature disagreed. And British General John Charteris, he wrote in his diary, "Every brook is swollen and the ground is a quagmire. If it were not that all the records of previous years had given us fair warning, it would seem as if Providence had declared against us." So very disappointing. And now we're in August. Now we're in the time when they know it's going to get rained out, and hopes for a successful attack are starting to get a lot trickier than they were before. So what's happening in August?
You got to give the British one thing, if nothing else. They don't give up easily.
Yes.
They persevere.
To a fault.
Yes. Once again, let's try one more time. On August 10th, the British launched another attack, but it failed. So what do? You try again. On the 16th, they launched another attack, and it was stopped. Meanwhile, a Canadian attack on Hill 70, which was designed to pull German troops away from Ypres, in mid-August, actually gained most of its objectives. How about that? The French army, you got to have the trust the Canadians. Not that we're not mocking the British soldiers. It's not that the British soldiers were bad. They had many, many things going against them at this time. The French army launched another diversionary attack at Verdun. That attack ended in mid-September. By August 22nd, the British advance had slowed to a crawl. By then, they advanced only about 2 miles, which was 1/2 of the first day's objective. So, that's like 23 days since July 31st, and they'd only gone 2 miles. On September 20th, the British launched another new assault under the command of General Harold Plumer, beginning with a barrage that would include 3.5 million shells. That's quite a few. The infantry then attacked. They pushed the Germans back, and they took many pillboxes, and this caused a little bit of a crack in the Hindenburg line. So it's starting to look pretty good. Yeah, maybe we're getting there. On the 26th, Plumer's Second Army again attacked at Polygon Wood. The British took several more German strong points, but they lost thousands of casualties. And the Germans began to get a little worried. On October 4th, the British attacked again. This is the Battle of Brunsinde. Once again, we see that what is often called a battle, as the Third Battle of Ypres, was really more of a campaign, which had several small battles as part of it. And the British on October 4th advanced nearly 1 kilometer. Wow, 1 kilometer. Less than a mile. They inflicted about 30,000 German casualties, suffering 25,000 themselves. The German leadership began to rethink its entire defensive strategy. And then the rains came again. Intense rain turned the front into mud. But Haig ordered an assault for October 12th anyway. And not surprisingly, the attack failed. Many men, Scott's already touched upon this previously, many men sank to their waists. Some were even drowned. Some men just got completely sucked down into the mud like quicksand and were never heard from again. Heavy guns disappeared into the mud, as did many wounded men. Just an awful, horrible situation. By mid-October, British casualties at Third Ypres were about 150,000, while the Germans had lost about 250,000. Between October 23 and 26, the French army gained about 6 miles at La Malmaison. Sorry about that, French people. I'm sure I butchered it. But in early November, Canadian forces took the village of Passchendaele and the ridge nearby. And this is considered the end of the battle. After this, winter sets in and there's not going to be a lot going on. And Scott, you had a really good quote.
Yeah, there's a few here. They all strike the same note here, but Private Pat Burns, member of the 46th Canadian Infantry Battalion, said in November 1917, "We couldn't believe we were expected to attack in such appalling conditions." And he's talking about the mud, the torrential downpour, and everything that James described. "I never prayed so hard in my life. I got down on my knees in the mud and prayed to God to bring me through." And James mentioned Lord of the Rings earlier, but as I was looking at the notes for this episode, I was checking up on the experiences of J.R.R. Tolkien in World War I, because many have noted that his experience there informed his writings and even different scenes in Lord of the Rings. And I don't believe he was involved here. I think he was knocked out either in the Battle of Verdun, if I'm not mistaken.
I'm not really sure what battle he was in. I saw the movie about his life recently, but they didn't really specify it.
It was either Verdun or Battle of the Somme.
It had to be the Somme because the British weren't at Verdun.
Oh, yeah, right. And now our circuits are getting crossed all over the place. All right. The Battle of the Somme. So he was there. Don't believe he was here at Ypres. But what's interesting is so much of the imagery here, it sounds like the dead marshes that Frodo and Sam and Gollum are going through.
Yeah.
This sinking, horrible place that reeks of death. And the imagery invokes and informs a lot of his later works there. So all the accounts here are striking the same note that they may not be feeling the shock and awe that we described earlier of mines being detonated. I mean, yes, there are artillery strikes going on, but the stench, the decay of death, the slog, that was why that word came to me as I was thinking about this battle, the slog, the feeling weighing down of the soul that everyone seems to be saying. So what happens, James? What's the result of all this? What effect does this have on the war?
All right, well, on the war, not so much. But in all, the Allies gained about 5 miles of ground at the cost of 70,000 dead and 170,000 wounded. That's a lot for 5 miles. The Germans had 83,000 killed, 250,000 wounded total, and they lost 26,000 prisoners of war. Many of the British dead drowned in shell holes. Just a horrible, horrible experience. And there's a lot of quotes. Dan Carlin gives a lot of the quotes from soldiers who watched
more brief word
buddies
from our sponsors.
Just sink down into the mud. Even people tried to rescue them, as you touched upon earlier, using boards and rifles, and they just couldn't get them. Sometimes people trying to do the rescue would be sucked in too. So just an awful, kind of like the Dead Marches, just an experience that is burned upon your conscience and you never forget it. Just not even just regular war, but just horror on top of the usual stuff, the machine guns and the artillery shells and the rifle fire. You've got the mud just literally claiming people, just sucking people in. It was just one of the most awful battles in the war. General Haig's reputation was damaged, and he has been widely criticized for not stopping the attack after Brunsinde several days before the end. Again, here's another quote from John Keegan. I'm real big on Keegan for some reason this episode, but he had some good quotes. On the Somme, Haig had sent the flower of British youth to death or mutilation. At Passchendaele, he had tipped the survivors into the slough of despond. That sounds like something out of Paradise Lost, or the slough of despond. Maybe that is. I don't know.
Pilgrim's Progress, where there's a literal name for different places.
Yeah, that's what I meant. Pilgrim's Progress. Yeah. Okay. So Haig doesn't get any points really for this, and I can't believe I forgot he was an overall commander. I claim a senior moment. Scott, you can't claim that, but Scott just had a baby, folks, so he hadn't slept in a long time.
Yeah, happens, folks. So sleep deprivation.
We're sorry about our mental lapses, but we'll try to get our game back. Wow, I wish we just had a couple, right, Scott? That's not bad. But let's talk about the effect on the British people. The British morale, both at home and on the front, of course, plummeted. It just seemed like nothing would ever go right. And Third Ypres was the last great battle of attrition of the war. We're going to see later that in 1918, the nature of warfare on the Western Front is going to change. We're going to go from this constant stalemate where you're fighting and losing thousands and tens of thousands of guys for just a mile or a half a mile. It's going to go back to being a war of movement, but you guys are just going to have to wait. we're going to keep you in suspense for just a little while longer.
Yeah, I almost wonder if, I don't know, some kind of like some fresh blood will enter the war, and or maybe it'll just be the same old people. I really don't know one way or another.
Yeah, maybe another nation will join. You never know.
Well, I think we've hammered the point home about this battle, and but I have one more quote here because I think it's worth remembering just to transport you back into that situation and give you a taste of what it's like. It's only fair. When I was talking about the imagery of the Third Ypres campaign, of high contrast black and white photos, mud pockmarked with artillery shells that had exploded, and what looked like a large stump sticking out of the ground that used to be a tree, many of those photos came from Frank Hurley, who was a war photographer. He was Australia's official war photographer. And he wrote about the experience later. He said that every 20 paces lay a dead body. He wrote, most were desperately mutilated without legs, arms, and heads, and half covered in mud and slime, and under a questionable sheltered bank lay a group of dead men, and sitting by them in little scooped-out recesses sat a few living, but so emaciated by fatigue and shell shock you couldn't tell the difference. So I think it's good that at this point, we are moving more to a war of movement, since the stalemate seems to have gone on forever, and I'm sure the soldiers have to be crushed at this point. And I can sympathize with groups that are mutinying, because at this point they might think, well, what do we have left to lose? So when you see how much change happens in the world, if it's Russia becoming socialist, whether soldiers mutinying, some completely losing their sanity, shell shock, which today we would call PTSD, in light of the conditions, I think you can understand better. So I don't have anything else to say for this. Do you have anything to add, James, before we close this out?
No, that's it. We've looked recently at one of the huge, just epic, earth-shattering events that occurred in 1917, the Russian revolutions, and in particular the second one, the Bolshevik Revolution, that completely altered the nature of the war. And next time we're going to look at another major, major event that's also going to have you can't overestimate the effect that it's going to have on the war, and that is the entry of another nation into the war. That would be the good old United States of America.
The Yanks are coming, listeners, so hope you enjoy that, and we are going to see you over there.